Okay, thank you for the opportunity to present this work here. I'm really trying to get this out there as much as possible so that people can start to think about these proposals, which are really not familiar thinking for people who are trained in the traditional way, thinking about monetary economies. This is joint work with Jaromir Benes, my colleague at the International Monetary Fund. And so by way of introduction, I have been reading a lot of books about monetary history over the last few years. And I have found that the thinking in the 1930s was in fact far more profound than the thinking that we find today. A lot of what we find today with a lot of the reform proposals amounts to tinkering with the plumbing of an existing system rather than thinking about how could we redesign the system from the ground up and not have many of the problems that we have today in the first place. Okay? The Chicago Plan was originally supported by the likes of Irving Fisher, Henry Simons, Frank Knight, Milton Friedman. Those were all giants of economic thinking in their time, and some of them were the founders of the Chicago School, which was in favor of laissez-faire in industry, not in finance. Very important distinction. And in a nutshell, what the Chicago Plan proposed is the separation of the monetary and credit functions of banking by requiring that deposits and money, I can use those two terms interchangeably because in today's economy, virtually all money is bank deposits and only a tiny, tiny fraction is the printed notes in your wallet. So deposits or money must be 100% backed by public reserves. And I'm also going to adopt a very broad definition of deposits because a lot of things are money. Some of them more, some of them less. I'm going to talk about all these safe liabilities offered by the financial system as money, not just about checking deposits. Okay? The other part of the Chicago Plan is that credit cannot be financed by creation ex nihilo of bank deposits, and I will explain what I mean by that in case it isn't already clear to you, because that's how bank money creation works these days. And so comparing the key characteristics of the Chicago Plan and today's financial system provides very useful insights for policy. What would it do to transition from one system to the other? So first of all, let's understand banks. Two key insights here, or two and a half, really. The key function of money is money creation, not intermediation. Okay? The entire economics literature that you see out there today will tell you that the function of banks is intermediation. Taking the money from granny, putting it in there, storing it up, and then when somebody comes and needs it, I can lend it out to them. That is complete nonsense. Okay? The intermediation, of course, exists. Of course it exists, but it is incidental and secondary, and it comes after the actual money creation. Banks do not need to attract deposits before they lend money. Rather, they create deposits out of nowhere in the act of lending. And I'm a former bank manager. I worked for Barclays Bank for 5 years. I've created those book entries. That is how it works. And if a leading light economist like Paul Krugman tries to tell you otherwise, he does not know what he's talking about. Okay? And so what happens is when you make a new loan, when somebody comes into your bank as a bank manager, and you approve that loan because you think it's a good credit risk, then you enter on the asset side of your balance sheet the loan, which is your claim against this guy. And on the liability side, at the exact same time, you create a new deposit. You have created new money because this gives this guy purchasing power to go out and buy something with it. Banks have created money at that point. Okay? No intermediation, because the asset and the liabilities, they are in the same name at that moment. Now what happens afterwards, of course, is that guy can take that deposit elsewhere and spend it. But it's still in the banking system, because all I care about as a macroeconomic theorist is I care about the aggregate banking system. Sometimes taking this step and just looking at the micro of an individual bank and then transferring the logic to the macroeconomy can be really, really wrong. And here it is. Okay? So what that means is that it becomes very, very easy for banks to start and later crash a lending boom, because if they feel like the economy is good, even though the central bank might not, even though policymakers might not, They simply expand the money supply. Because they do not need, the third parties are not involved here. It's just the bank and the customer, and I make the loan. Okay? The only thing that is required is that somebody else will then later accept that deposit as payment for, say, a machine, $1 million machine. But that's given, legal fiat, right? Bank liabilities by legal fiat are a means of payment. He knows that that's acceptable. Okay? Now, there's an important corollary to this story. When you think about loans for investment purposes, right? A lot of loans, like Ulf has shown, are not really for investment purposes in physical capital anymore. But those that are, let's think about those, because the academic literature still mostly focuses on those. Small fraction. What happens there is not, the story that is often told in development economics is that first you need to have savings, and then once you have the savings, you can have investment. So a country needs to have sufficient savings in order to have enough investment. Nonsense too. At least for the part of investment that is financed through banks. Because when a bank makes a new loan, it creates new purchasing power for the investment to go ahead. The investment goes ahead. Then the investor takes his new bank deposit and gives it to somebody else who leaves it in the bank. Or maybe it takes a few more steps, doesn't matter. In the end, somebody is going to leave that new deposit in the bank. That's saving. The saving is created along with the investment. It's not that saving needs to come before investment. Really important insight for anything to do with development economics. The second thing we need to understand about banks is that the deposit multiplier that is taught in economics textbook is a fairy tale. I could use less polite terms. The story goes that the central bank creates narrow money, and then broad money is just a multiplier. There's a multiplier in between. It's just an endogenous result, because the banks can always lend out a fraction, and then the next bank can lend out a smaller fraction, and et cetera, et cetera. Why is this a fairy tale? Because it actually turns the monetary transmission mechanism on its head. It's actually exactly the opposite. Okay? Broad monetary aggregates lead the cycle empirically. Narrow monetary aggregates lag the cycle. And this evidence that I'm referring to is actually for the period during the 70s and 80s when the Fed in the US was trying to target monetary aggregates. Nowadays, it's not even trying to do that, right? It's using an interest rate. And when you're trying to fix an interest rate through policy, then you have to let quantities adjust accordingly. So today, under inflation target, it actually makes no sense to say that the central bank can have much control over these narrow monetary aggregates, over its reserves. And in fact, a 2010 paper by the Fed finds exactly that. There is no deposit multiplier in the US, none. Comes from the horse's mouth, right, from the Fed. So the bottom line is, when the banks ask for reserves, the central bank obliges, which means that the transmission starts with deposit creation, or loan creation originally by the banks, and ends with reserve creation. What that means is that banks have almost full control over the money creation process. Subject, of course, to there being a certain demand for loans, right? There have to be some profitable projects that you want to invest in. The only tool that the Fed has for affecting the money supply is very blunt. It's the policy rate. It does have an effect on the money supply, of course it does. But it's a very, very blunt tool, because you really have to bludgeon the economy to the point where some of the bank's potential borrowers become not creditworthy anymore. You have to make some borrowers not creditworthy. That's a very, very blunt tool to control the money supply. And in fact, it isn't used for that, right? I mean, at least not primarily under inflation targeting. So the 6 advantages of the Chicago plan that I now briefly want to go through. 4 were identified in Fisher's brilliant book in 1936. There's a short version and a long version. I highly recommend the short version, because then at least you can be sure you will get through that, and it's about 25 pages. Much better control of bank lending-driven business cycles or credit cycles, complete elimination of bank runs, dramatic reduction of the net public debt, dramatic reduction of private debts. And I will show you all of this. And in our paper, we build actually a state-of-the-art monetary model that can compete with any academic model, except that we remove the mistake in academic models that the primary function of banks is intermediation, and we say the primary function of banks is money creation. That's the thing that's different, okay? And then we find that we can realize large output gains from this, and liquidity traps, which are a major concern in economic policy making today, would also disappear. And inflation would be very low. So this is also not inflationary. So, detail, complete elimination of bank runs. Monetary liabilities must be fully backed by reserves of public money. That's the essence of the Chicago plan. So it makes no sense for me to run on the bank because I know I'm going to get my money. Credit assets must be funded by non-monetary liabilities because otherwise there could be runs on those, and there could be loss of monetary control if somebody else creates monetary substitutes. For that, we would either have the credit financed by loans from the Treasury, entirely by bank equity. That's, for example, Larry Kotlikoff's proposal in limited purpose banking, or private non-monetary debts, and you need to ensure that those debts remain non-monetary. This is a bit of a technical issue. It's going to be covered in the next version of this paper that I'm going to put out on my website within a week or two, but it's perfectly feasible. The next issues are dramatic reduction of net public debt and from the numbers, the concrete numbers that I'm going to get is from 80% debt to 30% assets of the government, dramatic reduction of private debts from 180% to 90% of GDP, and that requires an explanation, that requires balance sheets. And so a balance sheet on the left-hand side has the assets of the entity, and on the right-hand side it has a combination of its liabilities and its own capital or its equity, right? And this is our best rendering of the balance sheet of the aggregate US financial system. We really went into the data to try to get this right. And all numbers are in percent of GDP. And we including the shadow banking system. This is important because we don't want to leave that out of our analysis because that's actually slightly larger than the regular banking system in the US by now. And so we have on the liability side a very broad category called deposits, 184% of GDP. Then we have 20% of GDP government bonds, 100% short-term and mortgage loans, and 80% investment loans. So that's the point that we start from. Now the Chicago plan says those deposits, that blue thing on the top right, needs to be covered 100% by reserves. So these banks have to borrow reserves from the government and put that on the asset side of their balance sheet. On the liability side, what emerges is, of course, the IOU to the government for providing these reserves. Right? The government doesn't just provide these reserves as a gift. There is an IOU. And I call that treasury credit. At that moment, deposits are 100% covered by reserves. That's why it makes no sense to run on this type of institution anymore. Now I can split this institution into what I call money banks at the bottom and credit investment trusts at the top. The money banks are just a money warehouse that manage the payment system, and they can manage the payment system without having any concern in the world about the asset quality on the other side of their balance sheet, which means they can manage the payment system in a completely risk-free way. For example, if the economy had a major credit crisis, the payment system would no longer be an issue. The payment system would be safe. The credit investment trusts now have a huge position of treasury credit. All credit is financed by the government, it looks like. Of course, now, that's not something that we want, or at least most of us don't, and if I left it at this, all the free market types would really jump up and down. And I actually think there's a very good case for the government sharing this gain that it has, which amounts to recovering a whole lot of seigniorage from the banks. Seigniorage is the revenue from money creation, and putting it back into the public domain. And so now we're saying this treasury credit, it shares this treasury credit with its citizens. But first of all, it does something else. It cancels the government bonds. There's 20% of GDP government bonds on the asset side and treasury credit on the liability side. Very easy to just repay them. And the balance sheet becomes shorter. So just in case this is not clear, here we go, cancelled, gone. Treasury credit, we now pay what I call a citizen's dividend. The government pays a certain amount to every citizen, like the same for everybody in the economy would be one way of doing it, into citizens' accounts. So from its own huge accounts in the banking system to citizens' accounts. And the mandatory first use of this money would have to be, or of these balances would have to be, to repay any outstanding debts. And we're assuming that it's going to be paid to households and to what I call manufacturers, to pay all the short-term and mortgage loans, to repay them. Like this, the credit investment trusts would be very much shorter, and a lot of private debt, because of the citizens' dividend, has now disappeared. Then we have the credit investment trusts are still financed by treasury credit, and they're only engaging in a very narrow function, which is to finance productive loans to firms that make something. Everything else is more or less gone. Now, it's not completely gone. I'm papering over the fact that households are very heterogeneous, and there's still going to be some households that are very rich, have some money to lend, and some other households that even after the citizens' dividend have some borrowing needs. That's still there. And I'm talking about it in the paper. It's just not in the formal model, because the formal model needs to make some simplifications. Then there's a bank equity payout, because it no longer needs as much capital as before, because it's shrunk. But that's it. And then you could do something else, because when people see this, you have much less credit now, but it's still almost entirely financed by the government. Doesn't need to be the case. The government still can take some of this balance and repay its outstanding government debt that is not held by the financial system, which amounts to another 60% of GDP. And the holders of that government debt would then look for other fixed income instruments and put them into the private banking system. And we would end up with a structure where there is some financing by government, but not very much. This is not very desirable, though, because it is actually good to have some government debt outstanding, because it's a very important benchmark assets in financial markets. So it's probably good to have those separate gross positions outstanding, even though the net position of the government is highly negative. Now, the Chicago plan is completely non-inflationary. This doesn't come out so well, but basically that red area is the deposits. Inflation is determined by the relative supply of money and goods. The supply of goods is relatively constant here, at the beginning at least. The supply of money is completely constant. People say, oh, the government is printing a lot of additional money here. Nonsense. It is not. What the government is doing, it is requiring that the existing money be backed by reserves. And because the only money that matters is the one in people's pockets or in their bank accounts. That remains at 184% of GDP throughout this whole episode. But it represents something different. In the beginning, it represented debt. And that's very fragile. It is what somebody at the ECB called destructible money when I was there. Because when the banks decide they don't want to lend so much anymore, or when there are defaults, some of that money gets destroyed. Because it all depends on what happens on the asset side of the balance sheet. When we're at the end of the Chicago plan, we're in a situation where all of this money is backed 100% by reserves. That's indestructible money. That's what changes, not inflation. This is the change in the government balance sheet. So we start off, before the Chicago plan, with government bonds of 80% of GDP and some unspecified other assets. I just wanted the government balance sheet to look balanced. It doesn't matter what that is. And then we issue these reserves on the liability side of the balance sheet, and we acquire the treasury credit claim on the banking system. The very important thing to realize is that these reserves are not debt. When you go to the US and you take this note, right? This is debt-based money, because that sits on the liability side of the Fed balance sheet, and on the other side sits government debt. But when you go to the US, and unfortunately I have to use a Swedish coin and pretend it's a US coin, this type of money in the US is issued by the Treasury directly. There's no debt anywhere else backing it. This is treated in the official accounts of the US as equity of the government, equity in the Commonwealth. This is a pure revenue, and it never will have to be repaid, because the only way you can ask for repayment of this money is in money. And therefore, what the Chicago plan amounts to is to say that all money should legally have this status, equity of the government. And then what that means, of course, once the Chicago plan the final stages of the Chicago plan have been implemented, is that the government ends up with a huge equity position and actually a negative debt position. You take the government debt minus the treasury credit, and even after the citizens' dividend, it is still negative. Okay? So what the economy is doing here is a huge debt equity swap. Finally, large output gains approaching 10%. First of all, when there is a huge debt equity swap, debt levels are lower. Lower debt levels tend to mean lower interest rates and lower interest rate spreads. Lower interest rates and lower interest rate spreads mean more investment, and that means more capital, and that means more output. Secondly, the government would, in this economy, be able to take in flow seigniorage revenue every period of about 3.5% to 4%. because in a growing economy, you need to increase the money stock every year by so much, just because that, money is the lifeblood of the economy, needs a little bit more every year when the economy grows. And because this money stock is now so big, just growing it by 2% per annum gives you a revenue of over 3.5% of GDP. And I'm assuming in the model that that's spent on lowering taxes, distortionary taxes. That gives a huge stimulus to the economy. Productive potential is unleashed. Thirdly, lower monitoring costs, because in this economy, money creation no longer requires debt creation. So guys like me who work for Barclays Bank to make loans, basically, I like to think of myself as a potentially productive member of society, and all I did was make these loans that created a money supply that could easily have been created debt-free. I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? There is a useful function of banking, making industrial loans, and all that monitoring is very useful. But part of the activity of banks is to create a debt-based money supply that can be totally taken out of the system if the money supply is created debt-free. And all those people and all the time and money that they spend in order to do what they do can be redeployed elsewhere in the economy, going from Citibank to GE and making some actual useful implement. And that's also a gain of 1 to 2% of GDP, according to our simulations. The main macroeconomic variables under the Chicago Plan, here's a simulation. On the horizontal axis, we have 60 quarters, and the dotted line in each case is just telling you where we jump to in the very, very long run. The solid line is the actual transition over 60 quarters, meaning 15 years. And so, look on the right column first. The real wholesale lending rate drops by, in the long run, about 250 basis points. The labor tax rate by 5 percentage points. The capital tax rate by 4 percentage points. The consumption tax rate by 1 percentage point. All of that gives a stimulus to economic activity, especially to investment, which grows by over 25%, meaning it would grow from something like 18% of GDP to something like 23 or something like that. Right? It sounds like a big number, but in terms of share of GDP, it's a big number. Anyway, so that big increase in investment in the long run builds up a capital stock, and GDP would increase by 10%. Now the numbers, we can talk about the numbers. The principles are more important. Right, and why we have these increases. The other thing that's important is that the inflation rate can easily be lowered to 0%, and that's something we still need to talk about. Here are the fiscal variables. The debt to GDP ratio drops by only 20%, but the deficit to GDP ratio, because of much lower real and nominal interest rate, drops by almost 3%. And the really important stuff is in the right column again. The seigniorage over GDP, that's the revenue from money creation over GDP, goes up by 3.6%, and tax revenue to GDP goes down by 3.6% because it's financed out of this seigniorage. And that means that these distortionary taxes can all drop, and that was one of the reasons why there was so much stimulus to economic activity. Then, fifth point, much better control of bank lending-driven business cycles. Under the Chicago Plan, bank money creation becomes impossible. Banks become true intermediaries, like they tell you what they are in the textbooks, but they're not. Right? The textbooks are wrong for today, but for the Chicago Plan, they would be right. This makes it much easier to dampen the real effects of credit cycles, and it makes the financial system much more resilient to shocks. So here I have a simulation of a bank-driven business cycle. And the black line is the system that we have to do today, and the broken blue line is the system under the Chicago Plan. And what I'm assuming here is that over a period of 3 years or 12 quarters, banks just get more optimistic about the riskiness of their borrowers. And it will turn out in the end that all of that optimism was not based on fundamentals, but for a while it looks like it is. So for 12 quarters, these banks grow their loan book by 50% of GDP. And if you look at the bottom, bank deposits also go up by 50% of GDP. That's how the banks finance themselves. They create their own finance in the act of lending. Okay? And what this does, it leads to growth of GDP of about 2% here in this particular simulation. And then when the banks suddenly realized this was all based on the wrong premises, then the economy really crashes. What happens there is that interest rates shoot up even more. The bank Basel ratio at the top right goes into the basement. It starts at 10.5%, and 8% is the minimum capital adequacy ratio under Basel, and a lot of banks get very close to their 8%, and they start to really scramble in order to get out of that hole by raising their lending rate and earning their way out of trouble and screwing the rest of the economy in the process. Okay? Now, if you look at bank loans here, when this crisis happens, they drop by 70% of GDP in 1 quarter. Now, this is just an illustrative simulation. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a very realistic magnitude, but the principle matters here. The principle is that if you have a model where banks are intermediaries that have to slowly intermediate somebody's saving, this could never happen. And credit has to just gradually go down. In the real world, this can happen because banks can create and destroy their own funding. Okay? And under the Chicago plan, basically what I'm assuming is it's not just the Chicago plan world where the banks cannot create their own money anymore. It is also something that Richard Werner has been advocating is quantitative lending guidance. So that the government imposes actually higher capital adequacy requirements in case the bank's lending goes completely berserk and they really want to expand their lending. By the way, all the lending is only for investment purposes here now, right? There's a little bit of lending for consumption smoothing, but it's mostly for investment purposes because all those other private loans have been repaid. Now, and by the way, a counter-cyclical capital adequacy requirement is explicitly allowed under Basel III. Under the new Basel III rules, that's one of the things that the government could implement. And I'm just saying we implement this and we make it quite aggressive. And what then happens is, if you look at the top right, the bank Basel ratio, when the banks start to lend more, then they start to get more optimistic. They have to put a lot of capital aside in order to do this. Right? The bank Basel ratio rises from 10.5% to 15.5% almost over those 3 years. That means that the banks have less incentive to lend because it becomes more expensive, right? And so they raise their lending rate more in the pre-crisis period, and their loans themselves rise by far less during this period. So this restrains lending before the crisis, and then when the crisis happens, banks have a really nice big capital cushion. So they lose quite a bit of money there too, but they can easily take it because they have this capital cushion. And that means that the crisis is far less deep, and the contraction in GDP is about half of what it was in the other simulation. So if you combine the Chicago plan with something like quantitative lending guidance, you would get far less volatile business cycles as well. Finally, no liquidity traps. The main tools of monetary policy under the Chicago plan are a nominal money growth rule a la Milton Friedman, but it's on very broad money, not like what they tried in the 70s and 80s on this minuscule reserve money. Right? And that's meant to control inflation. Then we have an interest rate rule, but that controls the price of treasury credit to banks. That's sort of an open tap that the government provides for the banks that lend to real physical investment activity. And then these counter-cyclical Basel capital adequacy rules. Now, what's a liquidity trap? A liquidity trap is either when the liquidity trap is when the central bank cannot stimulate the economy effectively anymore by either printing more money or lowering interest rates. None of that can happen under the Chicago plan because money is directly under the control, broad money is directly under the control of the government. Under the present system, the government can only affect narrow money and hope that the private banks will then expand broad money. Here the government directly expands broad money, no liquidity trap. The other issue is the zero interest rate floor, which applies when the government, as it does today, controls an interest rate on an asset. And an asset that is government bonds, and the alternative to holding that is money, which pays a zero interest rate. So if you go below zero, then people will switch to cash, and so you can't do it very effectively. In this economy, the government doesn't control that interest rate anymore. It lets it be determined by the market. And instead it controls the rate at which it lends additional money balances to banks, to credit investment trusts who want to lend to the real economy. And that's and as long as arbitrage can be prevented there, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be, because you just, you give the money to these banks for investment projects, and if not, then they're in trouble. Then that means that this rate can very easily go below zero, right? Temporarily, not forever. But if there's a very bad business cycle, you can lower it below zero. Again, no liquidity trap. That, by the way, means if you can lower a rate easily below zero, then that means that the whole debate about how much steady-state inflation should we have, because we want higher steady-state inflation means higher nominal interest rate, and so that means I'm safely away from the zero lower bound, and so I want to build in a sufficient safety margin by having enough steady-state inflation. When that's no longer an issue, I don't need high steady-state inflation to be safe. Meaning I can put steady-state inflation to zero and there's no problem. Meaning I could have a zero steady-state inflation economy here compared to what we have today. Okay? Any disadvantages of the Chicago Plan? The only reasonable concern is the transition period, of course, wouldn't be easy. Right? But what I want to drive home here is, on the other side, is a very good world. So you have to do a trade-off, a cost-benefit analysis between that very good world and the problems that you might face in this transition. And by the way, neither Fisher nor Friedman, Milton Friedman, thought that this was a problem, this transition, that it could be done. Right? And if we feel that we need to change the financial system anyway, let's say we were in another financial crisis, heaven forbid, but let's say we were, and we need to do something anyway, then we might as well do the right thing, right? And that's all I'm trying to say here. The unnecessary concern is that the banking system could become uncompetitive. That's not a reasonable concern. First of all, this banking system remains entirely private. I'm not talking about nationalizing banks in any way, shape, or form. The deposit banks would be able to provide state-of-the-art payment system without any worries about the safety of the loans on the other side of their balance sheet. That makes for a more efficient payment system. The lending banks would efficiently allocate capital without the risk of what's happening on the other side of their balance sheet, which could be bank runs. When you're always threatened with a bank run, you don't want your assets to be too long run, because then you might be caught out, right? So the lending banks operate as in today's textbooks. They first attract deposits, then they lend them out. And if that's not enough, at least for the real physical investment, they would be supplemented by a treasury credit line where the government could print extra money for them, subject to these capital adequacy requirements and subject to an interest rate rule for that rule at which the government lends to them. There would be a very effective mobilization of long-term savings, except that under the Chicago Plan, this only requires credit creation, not money creation. Okay? So the only change, we would have a lot of institutions that would operate like our textbooks tell us to, like these mom-and-pop banks that really do the right thing. What we would no longer have is banks, or the part of activity of banks that is devoted to creating a money supply through debt that can easily be created debt-free. Okay? So, how much do I have? How much time do I have? Okay, then I'm going to say this slide and then the conclusion. Okay? I have a section on history, monetary history, in the paper. And I think it is very, very important to study monetary history in order to understand these issues, because that's your empirical evidence, not running regressions on data from the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. Because which monetary system works, we have millennia of experience with that. And there are people who have actually looked into that. That's the real evidence that we should be looking at. A long line of distinguished thinkers are mentioned in the papers that have advocated this type of monetary system, Adam Smith not being one of them, of course. The historical experience is very strongly in favor of it, in the sense that in the US and the UK at least, and also Germany, periods of private money issuance led to constant financial crises, and the prior periods of government money issuance led to some crises, but by no means as many, far fewer, far fewer. Then some people would say, well, you must be wrong here, because if you look at all those financial crises of the last 100 years, that's surely a counter-argument. That's really bad thinking. That's a logical error. Because the crises over the last 100 years, during those crises, governments have been operating in monetary systems more or less like what we have today. Not very different. Meaning that in those systems, banks were in charge, ultimately, the ultimate arbiters of the overall amount of money in the economy. Not to the same extent as in the US today, where they're really just almost 100% in charge, but at the margin, they were in charge. So if anything, therefore, if you want to point to experience of the last 100 years, the first question you would have to ask is not, were central banks irresponsible and created these crises? You have to ask, were private banks irresponsible, and did they create these crises? And actually, if you look at the reinterpretation of the German hyperinflation of 1923 in my paper, which is completely misrepresented in a lot of writings, you will see that that conforms exactly to this story. It was created by private speculators, aided and abetted by what was at that time a private central bank. And this is not my statement. This is the statement of the guy who was the Reichsbank president at the time when this all happened. In his own book in 1967, he wrote that. Okay? So I'm going to skip over this stuff and concluding remarks. So the Great Recession has shown that too much of an exciting and innovative financial system can cause significant problems that distract attention from the real economy, like Ulf was saying. What I would argue is that what worked much better is a really boring financial system. A completely safe, crisis-proof payment system and banks that act as conservative intermediaries to channel money to the real economy. That's what we need. And if you look at this, the Chicago Plan has many elements of such a system. In fact, I have been talking to some people at the IMF. This is not the official policy line of the IMF. No need to say that, right? But I have been talking to some people at the IMF who work on financial stability and things like that, and the objectives that, that one can define in terms of what do we want to accomplish in the field of financial stability. And then you make tick marks against the Chicago Plan. You get a lot of tick marks, because this hits a lot of bases at the same time. The only question is, how do we get from here to there? Thank you.
Thank you.